The U.S. Supreme Court is likely to rule soon against race-based admissions policies at Harvard and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. What's the likely impact of such a ruling? Well, a new report from the Manhattan Institute might surprise you. We're joined now by that author of that report to talk a little bit about what happens after the Supreme Court has its say. The report is titled After Affirmative Action, Meritocracy, with a question mark at the end. And the author of that report is Robert VerBruggen, who is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I think a lot of us who have been following these cases say the U.S. Supreme Court could say Harvard and or UNC Chapel Hill, you can't use these race-based policies that you have used or use race as a factor in your admissions policies. And after that, race will be gone. Your report says that's not likely that is not likely to be what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, essentially, what I'm expecting them to do is both at private colleges that accept federal funding, which is most private colleges, and at government-run colleges, I'm expecting them to say that you basically can't use race the way that they've been using it so far, which has been to explicitly consider it in the process. When you apply to college, you tell the college your race. When the admissions officers are deciding who to let in, they take consideration of race in addition to all the other factors. I think that's not going to be allowed anymore. I think there's going to be some colleges that covertly just continue to do that, continue to grant preferences and hope to get away with it. But more directly, though, I think what's going to happen at a lot of these schools is they're going to turn to what are called race-neutral alternatives. And these are policies that are meant to ensure diversity without directly considering race in the admissions process. So you basically retool the process itself so that it delivers you a different demographic balance. And my report is basically a way of looking at that process, what we know about it from areas that have already banned affirmative action, what the possibilities are, and what to expect, given that over the past 10 years or so, we've seen a really big rush to ditch standardized testing, which opens up a whole new lane for these schools to run down when they're retooling their admissions policies to get a demographic balance that they want.
Now, you mentioned that these are race-neutral alternatives, but they won't mean that race disappears from the consideration.
Exactly. They're basically when you ban affirmative action at a school, the people in charge of that school tend to panic, right? They want to figure out ways of basically maintaining the racial balance that they had before, and they're oftentimes pretty blunt about that, pretty explicit about it. So what they do is they retool their process to deliver a certain racial result, but the process itself doesn't consider race. Some of these options are you can use socioeconomic preferences. Socioeconomic preferences can be a good and fair thing in moderation, but they have to be used pretty heavily a lot of the time to get to continue a racial result, especially at a very selective school that they had previously been getting with affirmative action. And a lot of times the socioeconomic boosts themselves have to be carefully calibrated to get the right racial result. For example, if you just give everybody who has a low parental income a boost, that tends not to have as disparate of an impact by race as you might expect. So a lot of people turn to factors like wealth instead of income, or considering neighborhoods, because if you look at the neighborhood data, Black Americans with a given level of income tend to live in poorer neighborhoods than whites with that same level of income. So you can use that variable, the neighborhood they live in, rather than their own income, to more carefully calibrate your demographics based on race. So these are very carefully considered policies that are very carefully and often explicitly designed to achieve a certain racial result.
One of the interesting things in your report is that despite the fact that what's being described as race neutral still factors in race, people across the political spectrum, including those who have been fighting these policies in court, seem to be okay with the race neutral alternatives.
Yeah, and that was something I found really interesting about the case and about the oral argument that was at the Supreme Court in both these cases on the same day. Essentially, under current precedent, if you're going to use race in your admissions process, technically you're supposed to be able to demonstrate that race-neutral alternatives can't achieve the diversity that you're trying to seek. So that became an issue in the case for that reason. And you have all of these briefs from the plaintiffs challenging it. basically laying out, here are the race neutral alternatives that we think would work. Here are the demographic results that they deliver. And then when they go to the Supreme Court, they're making a broader argument. They're not just saying that these places have to consider race neutral alternatives before turning to race. They're basically saying that race should be banned entirely. But yet they're still having these discussions about race neutral alternatives at the oral argument. And Sotomayor called them out on this. She said, look, you guys are coming to us with these plans where you're using socioeconomic preferences. You're coming to us with these, they're called percent plans. You might say that, the top 10% of high school graduates at each school are entitled to admission at a state school or what have you. You're coming to us with all of these alternatives and touting how great they are, and you're calling them race neutral alternatives, but they're not actually race neutral. You chose these specific policies and calibrated these policies so that they would achieve a diversity in race. And her point, of course, is if they can do that, why can't they just have an admissions policy that considers race as one factor among many, which is what we've been allowing for decades now. But I think people on the right, people who oppose affirmative action, have to ask themselves a similar question. We fought all this way, and now we're just going to end up with a system that poses a lot of the same problems as affirmative action, is going to be used as heavily as affirmative action, and is going to deliver the same racial results intentionally. So you're still going to have all these actors discriminating by race just in a roundabout way. I think it's an interesting question, and I think that's where the fight is going to turn after the ruling.
One of the key points in your report asks under the heading, how low could standards go? What could be the impact of shifting from the policies that have been used to this sort of race neutral alternative?
One interesting dynamic with this kind of issue is that if you want to achieve a specific racial balance, the most efficient way to do that is just to have a quota. Just have a quota. If you want to have 15% of your student population be Black, reserve 15% of the slots for Black students, and then after that, just use your regular admissions process to maximize all the other things you value, like their academic qualifications. That's the most efficient way of doing it. It's the way that you can achieve that 15% while lowering standards minimally. But if you have to use a policy that's race neutral on its face, if you have to ignore race in the process, but you're still trying to achieve the same racial numbers, which I think it's clear a lot of colleges are, you actually have to use much heavier preferences. You have to not just give preferences to the 15% of people you want, you have to give a much broader set of preferences to more people. So that's the dynamic that sort of forces colleges to sort of trade off between lowering their standards and achieving the racial results that they want once you've banned affirmative action. But the thing is, if you look at the history of affirmative action bans in the states, first of all, a lot of colleges, even before this recent rush to eliminate standardized testing, a lot of colleges were already able, in reasonably short order, to bring their racial numbers back to where they were. But there were a handful of exceptions. Some of the really notable ones are UCLA, UC Berkeley. And if you look at those colleges, they had a drop after the affirmative action ban in California that took a while to come back. But the thing is, I think now, especially in these past 10 years or so, you've seen this big rush to ditch standardized testing. So I think that gives them a whole new avenue to run down. And even at the most selective schools where they have normally would have a lot of trouble re-achieving their old racial results by using things like socioeconomic preferences and so on. Those schools, I think, now have an additional option at their disposal, which is to ditch standardized testing requirements or even go entirely test blind. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see where that plays out. And one thing I did in the report is look at data from the UC system. And UCLA is actually the most striking example of this. The affirmative action ban comes, the share of Black students drops pretty precipitously. That's one criticism of the affirmative action ban that critics made of it that's very true when you look at the data. And it stays low for a while, and they really struggled to bring it back. But over the past 10 years or so, it's slowly come back. And then a couple of years back, with the UC system ditches standardized testing, now if you look at the numbers, they're more or less admitting Black students the way they were before the ban. It's really striking in those numbers. So I think the UCLA route is going to be very tempting for a lot of elite schools.
If the ultimate goal is to have the universities make decisions based on merit, as the title says, meritocracy with a question mark, how likely is it that what we end up with after these Supreme Court decisions could be worse than what we have now?
I mean, I think it's a distinct possibility. I think the big question is really the question, how low can standards go? How much are they willing to make this trade-off of shoving down standards for everybody in the name of getting their diversity numbers back where they are? If they're willing to go really far to achieve that, which I think there's a lot of pressure on them to do these days, with especially again with the rush to ditch standardized testing, this could have the effect of simply undermining standards rather than of imposing a more meritocratic ideal on college admissions that's race blind.
So it sounds like the bottom line is even those who would like to see students for fair admissions, the plaintiffs in these cases, winning at the Supreme Court is not going to necessarily mean a win for the improvement of these college campuses and the way they go about their business, if some of these other negative impacts come from what the universities do to respond.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's going to be a sort of a multi-pronged fight going forward. When universities change their policies, if they're state universities, I think state legislatures might want to keep an eye on what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I think in the legal arena, there's going to be this question, and we see this a little bit with the Thomas Jefferson High School case out of Northern Virginia, which raises similar issues, even though it's a different legal matter in terms of high school versus college. They've historically been treated kind of differently. But there's this question legally of, okay, we have all these policies against discriminating. And in most areas of life, you're not allowed to say, well, I want to discriminate against Black people, but I can't do that legally. So I'm going to calibrate my process as much as possible to minimize the number of Black people I hire. That doesn't fly in court. You're not allowed to do that. So there's going to be this question legally of, how far can you go in the name of diversity through these race neutral alternatives before you actually start running afoul of, our statutes and running afoul of the Constitution and its guarantee of equal protection.
Well, it's certainly very interesting information to keep in mind, and people who are watching these Supreme Court cases very closely ought to pay attention to what happens after the rulings as well. The report, once again, is titled After Affirmative Action, Meritocracy, with a question mark. Its author is Robert VerBruggen, who is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.